Hello and welcome to the latest instalment of the UK SIF Leadership Podcast. This is James, and in today's episode we've got a recording for you from our autumn conference in November last year, where we had Michael O'Leary, Managing Director of Engine No.1, talking to us about the importance of engagement. There is unfortunately a little bit of background noise throughout this clip, but I'm sure you'll find it really fascinating. Michael's a fantastic speaker, and without further ado, onto the recording. Thank you. So I'm delighted to invite Michael O'Leary, Managing Director of Engine No.1, to speak with us. Michael's joining us from the US today. And Michael guides the firm's view on impact and active ownership of companies held across Engine No.1's funds. He's a pathfinder in the impact investing movement, dedicated to creating greater accountability in both the private and public sectors. Before joining Engine No.1, Michael worked at Bain Capital, where he was a founding member of the firm's Social Impact Fund, and an investor focused on consumer, technology, and industrials for the firm's private equity funds. He's also an author, written a book called Accountable: The Rise of Citizen Capitalism, which was published last year. And his writing's been featured across the financial news and further afield. Michael has a degree from Harvard College and an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really great to have you speaking with us. So I just want to welcome you and tell us what are you doing? Your work obviously has a really strong purpose. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What is the purpose of your work?
Yeah, thanks, James. I'm excited to be here. Excited to be with everyone. Engine No.1 is built on, in some ways, it's a single, simple idea, which is the long-term value of companies depends on the value those companies create for their workers, their employees, for their customers, for communities, for the environment, and that we can measure that value as investors, as market participants, that where traditionally we've looked just at net income or other measures of value to shareholders, we can broaden the aperture and try and measure the carbon that the company emits, the wages the company pays, the diversity of its workforce, the health impacts of the company's products. And if we can add up all those different sources of value, that we can then better understand the company's long-term risks, its long-term opportunities. This is not to say that it's based off some iron law of economics that always and everywhere forever, having a diverse workforce or paying your workers a living wage leads to higher returns. But it is to say that that's what matters to people today. That's what matters to talent. That's what matters to consumers. It's what matters to governments. It's thinking about regulation. It's what entrepreneurs are focused on as they're creating innovation. And so companies that are more focused on these issues, on climate change, on racial equity, wages and benefits, access to healthcare, financial inclusion, the companies that are creating solutions in these areas are going to be the ones that win. And that we can work at Engine No.1, we can work as active owners to try and improve that impact of companies and therefore help create long-term value. That's the idea. And at Engine No.1, I'll just say very quickly for folks who don't know the firm, right now we are essentially two funds. One is a concentrated equity fund, and then one is an index fund, essentially an S&P 500 sort of index fund, no exclusions, no reweightings, but then takes these ideas of long-term ownership, of working as an active owner through how we vote our shares, how we engage with companies to try and drive impact that way.
And you call that your total value framework, I think, don't you, in terms of the kind of philosophy around that? And so how did you arrive at that strategy as the real way to achieve impact? And I think, obviously there's lots of different ways to achieve impact, and you've kind of gone down this kind of really kind of key engagement route and voting and being a really active owner. How did you arrive at that strategy as the means to achieve the impact that you want to see?
Yeah, right now the ESG investing world is so broad and getting broader. As every dollar flows into the space, there's new funds, new strategies. Even just within large cap public equities, there's 1,000 different ways to try and invest. I think what we thought of was when we were building Engine No.1 was this idea that a lot of ESG investing in the public markets particularly has historically been very focused on exclusion, on exposure. What companies do I want in my portfolio? If I dislike a company or its mission or its impact, how can I exclude it or underweight it in my portfolio? And so you've got, in some ways, this very, very deep, rich history of religious exclusions in the US, going all the way back to the Quakers in the 1600s, that went right through the anti-apartheid movement, right through the divestment movement today. And I think in many ways that movement deserves so much credit for making, particularly the divestment movement, for making climate change such a front and center issue. What our theory of change was that the success of that movement has now created an opportunity for investors like us who want to take a very active approach, who want to not exclude these sorts of companies from our portfolio, but actually invest in them deliberately to try and drive change, that the success of the divestment movement has created opportunity for us to do so. And so our approach is, if you want to have impact in big public equities, you should take your seat at the table, you should use your voice, you should roll up your sleeves, and then actually try and drive that change through the shares we vote at annual meetings, through the engagements we can run, either alone or through organizations like Climate Action 100 or the UNPRI, and through activist campaigns. That is what we're best known for, is our campaign at ExxonMobil over the last year. And I think campaigns like that are only successful because we're building on decades of other investors who have made climate change such a front and center issue. And I think we're now in the position where we can use our power as investors. We can gather together with the other 50.1% of investors that we need to actually drive change in a public company, and then push for change in conjunction with all the other theories for change that happen out in the ESG universe. But I think uniquely so, trying to do it as an active owner from within.
Brilliant, that's fantastic. And you mentioned Exxon. That was where you guys, I think, really just came to prominence, and you kind of came to the fore. As you bought a comparatively small stake in Exxon. You corralled, as you say, the other 50.1%, the necessary numbers, and you got 3 board members, I guess climate kind of focused board members onto Exxon's board. An amazing achievement, a massive coup. What? Tell us about how that worked. How did that campaign go? How did it succeed? But also, I'm really interested in what happens now. Okay, we've got these 3 board members on the board. Great. And I suppose there's a lingering doubt in my mind that for some companies like Exxon, can they transition? Are they capable of making that transition? Yeah. Or is it just too late for a company like Exxon and others need to kind of come in and be the people that will drive the net zero future?
No, it's an important debate. And I think I take a step back, and when you look at the scale of the challenge of climate change that we're already dealing with, we'll have to deal with in the coming decades, the scale of the problem we face means that transforming nearly every major industry on Earth, the way we generate energy, the way we grow food, the way we build cities, the way we move people and goods and heat our homes, that transforming nearly every major industry on Earth is less risky, less costly than not doing so. And that if you are the 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter in world history, as Exxon is, and if 2/3 of your business comes from countries that themselves have set net zero targets or setting net zero goals, you don't have an ESG problem, you don't have a sustainability problem, you have a core strategic problem. And that gradually but deliberately repositioning that business for a net zero world isn't the best option for that company, it's the only option. And so our strategy, starting long before we launched the campaign publicly, but publicly starting in last December, was we needed to put new directors on the board, all of whom had deep energy experience. I think one of the shocking things for a lot of people when we were talking to them during the campaign was that the board had all these incredibly impressive former executives, former CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, but none of whom had deep energy experience. If you think about what role does a board play in questioning the assumptions the management's giving to it, of setting the long-term strategy, of understanding how is the world shifting and how is our company adapting to meet those shifts, it's hard to do that for one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world if you yourself have never worked in oil and gas. And so we put forward 4 new candidates, all of whom had this deep energy experience, but all of whom understood very clearly how the world was changing and what a company like Exxon would need to do to meet that transition. And that campaign, as you said, we started with 2 basis points of ownership. In the public markets, you're only as powerful as the case you can make of the coalition you can build. We were lucky enough to start with a core group of partners, including CalSTRS, the big pension fund in California, but ultimately including folks like Church of England and New York Common and eventually the big index providers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Because to get any change in that regard, we would need to convince 49.9998% of our fellow shareholders. And come June, we were successful in getting 3 board members on the board. But you're right. I mean, this is the question that we ask ourselves. What has changed as a result? How different is Exxon today than it was last year? How different is Exxon today than it would have been if we'd never even run the campaign? I think it's worth remembering that any company, but especially an industrial company with long-lived assets like Exxon, where the average oil field in America can be 25, 30 years old, any company looks the way it does today as a result of the decisions that it made 10, 15, 30 years ago. And so the goal is not to radically transform the company today, it's to radically transform the trajectory of that company into the future so that the ExxonMobil of 5, 10, 30 years from now is now a part of the energy solution, is no longer actively holding back the world from achieving its net zero targets. And always, I mean, this is for, I'm sure there's a lot of impact investing folks on the Zoom, a lot of impact investing investors. There's always this question of additionality of how is the world different because of your investment. And I think the bar that we hold ourselves to is there was a trajectory, and always a matter of speculation, but there is a trajectory based off of our best guess of what Exxon would look like, what production would look like over a 5, 10, 40-year period of time. And there's a trajectory that we're trying to fashion today that still might not be perfect, but we measure ourselves by that gap in those 2 trajectories. But it's worth remembering, I'm sure everyone can hear the sirens going by. I mean, this is a crisis we're dealing with. And so, I think it's worth holding ourselves to a very high bar. It's worth holding each other to a very high bar of what are these different theories of change, what are these different strategies actually accomplishing? Are they accomplishing enough?
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think, it comes back to our shared view with you that if you didn't have that group of people that cared, that were stockholders in the company, you wouldn't be able to get the critical number of people to get these votes on the board to take the company's trajectory and think about, well, where does that go? Where does that go forward?
Actually, it's such a good point because one of the stories that was most influential to me in coming to this idea of using active ownership as our theory of change was of a utility in the US called NRG, which under its CEO, David Crane, 7 years ago, started to make this clean energy transition. He wrote in a shareholder letter, our grandchildren will sit us down in our dotage, they'll look us in the eye and they'll say, why? Why? You knew about climate change, you did nothing, why? And so he started doing 7 years ago what companies are only starting to do today, which is set ambitious net zero targets, start investing in renewable energy, charting a path for true transformation of NRG. And then an activist came in the stock, Elliott Management, came in the stock, was unhappy with the short-term returns that were resulting from that transformation, and not only forced David Crane out as CEO, but was able to appoint new board members, including Barry Smitherman, a climate denier, someone who'd once given a speech called the myth of greenhouse gas pollution, and shutting down all the renewable energy projects. And you just think, how were they able to do that? A true transformation in the making that was stymied by investors. And I think part of the reason is that the investors who cared most about climate change, who most should have been there at David Crane's defense to help preserve that transformation, had fled the stock on principle. And so is there now a role, especially given the success of the divestment movement and making this issue front and center, is there now a bigger role for investors to say, I own shares. That means I'm accountable for what happens in this company. It means I'm a partial owner of this company, and I can actually work to drive change as a result.
I think that's such an important point and something that we would definitely agree with. I guess the divestment piece, though, is an interesting challenge because, in the same way that we want people to stay at, to the extent that the company continues to contribute to the portfolio you want, to stay with that stock, to be active owners, to shape it into the future we want to see. Is there a challenge, though, that in a company like Exxon that needs to sell or get rid of its high polluting, fossil fuel assets and to invest in creating, renewable assets or whatever? Is there a risk that you take the divestment that you would have done up here at the stock level and you just move it down a layer? so that you still hold the company, but actually the polluting parts of the company you sell off and someone else then owns them. And so the same problem still arises, which is somebody owns assets that care about the planet and climate less than you do. How do you resolve that question?
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of the ESG investing movement today that I found most frustrating is this focus on what do things look like within the four walls of my portfolio. Have I achieved a net zero portfolio? Have I lowered the carbon emissions intensity of my portfolio? And I think we all have to take a step back and say, who cares what the carbon emissions of our portfolio is if the carbon emissions of the planet are not changing? I think you look at the tremendous amount of investment that's going into ESG strategies, that's being committed to the nation's principles for responsible investing. Mark Carney's new coalition at COP26 that is something like $140 trillion of investment is pledged against it. If that investment continues to grow in ESG strategies, it has zero impact on the actual emissions that are being emitted, then it's a little bit of like, for what? Why did we go through all of the trouble? Now, I think what a lot of people get hung up on with divestment is that there's still this huge lack of trust, I think, in a lot of institutions. I'll use like universities in the US as an example, where if students go to the endowment and they say, you're invested in these oil and gas companies, you're part of the problem, you're profiting off the destruction of our climate, and we want you to divest, and the endowment comes back and says, oh, no, we believe in engagement, we believe in you're trying to drive change from within as an active owner. The problem is the students don't trust the endowment. They don't believe that. And in my book, Unaccountable, I wrote about a scenario where Harvard then went back to the students to try and prove all the great things they were doing. And it was like a one-pager where they'd anonymize the companies. So they said, at company A, we did this, at company B, we did this. And if you're in a situation of distrust, the way you build that trust is not by anonymizing your companies and kind of obfuscating what's actually happening. And so, the end of that story is Harvard ended up divesting because the students were not willing to take anything less. Divestment is effective in a low trust environment because it's binary. You either do or you don't. And so that's what we very much are trying to do at Engine No.1 is use transparency in our favor, use clear metrics that you can hold us accountable to, things like what are the net carbon emissions total from a company like Exxon, and judge us against the shifting of that trajectory to try and rebuild this trust that you can actually accomplish real change as an active owner. But it's got to be an incredibly high bar because if we're not successful in actually shifting the trajectory, if other investors aren't successful in driving change from within, then we don't have much of an argument against others who then say, we need to regulate these companies out of existence, or we need to, take away their social license to operate, and every dollar is invested is standing in the way.
Yeah, and I guess that's where our kind of ongoing view is very much that we can play a role up to a point as investors and as financial services, the community of financial services. We have levers that we can pull. We are in a unique position as owners of these stocks, but sometimes we may hit a brick wall with this stuff, and so at some point, government can't just outsource everything to financial services and say it's going to be okay.
Well, I think we're oftentimes given this false choice where people say, oh, is this, I spent a very little time in democratic politics, and all my old colleagues from that world would say, I agree with you on the problems, but we already have a solution for this, and it's called government, and we need to be passing better regulations. And it's such a false choice because, of course, we need to be doing more through our government. And of course, we need to be doing more as investors and as employees and as consumers and as philanthropists. This is when you look at issues like wages and workforce issues and racial equity and healthcare and financial inclusion and climate change. These are issues that are so expansive that we need to be working on them in every aspect of our lives. And so one thing we always come back to at Engine No.1 that I always come back to as an investor is to say, what can we uniquely accomplish through this vehicle as investors? There are certain things that are better left to philanthropists, certain things are better left to governments, but especially in cases where with Exxon and with others, we think that as investors, we can try and transform a company from within in ways that will benefit both the planet, its stakeholders, and ultimately the long-term value of the company. That is a solution that all investors should be pushing, not to the exclusion of other solutions, not to the exclusion of better regulation, but in conjunction.
Yeah. I think that's right, and that's part of our philosophy as an organization as well. I want to come back to the point that you made around trust, and I think we see this in the UK as much as you described it in the US, which is, when we say, oh, we're doing great engagement, we're doing great stewardship, we're active owners, people kind of say, well, really, prove it. What are you doing? Is it true? How do we build? What needs to happen, whether it's inside the industry or whether it's through better regulation or what, to build trust that active ownership is really impactful and a key way we can make it?
Yeah. Well, it's so hard. And I would say, unfortunately, there is reason for a lot of distrust in financial services in general for many reasons. Outside of ESG, there's reason for distrust. Within ESG, I would say the biggest barrier to get over right now is that you have some of our largest asset managers, especially in the US, but in Europe as well, in the UK, some of our largest asset managers who for years have talked about climate change, who have put out funds about climate change. But then when you actually look at their voting records, that they voted against 90% of climate-related proposals. Right? I mean, this is our largest index, multi-trillion-dollar index managers who have operated this way. My favorite example outside of the climate realm is there was a gender empowerment-focused fund with the ticker symbol SHE that voted against 80% of gender and diversity-related proposals. Right? So exactly the sort of thing that you thought you were pushing for by moving your dollars in this fund, your dollars were actually hampering, holding back. Right? And so I think there's reason why people kind of raise their eyebrows a little bit when some CEO of an asset manager says, oh, we care so much about this issue, because when we can actually see the record, we can see the receipts, and it is directly contrary to what we're being told. So I think one very easy way, one very clear way to help restore that trust is with transparency. I think this is the great work that standard-setting bodies, that SASB and TCFD and others are trying to do by setting standards, pushing for transparency. In many ways, this is what the big investor coalition groups like Climate Action 100 can be so helpful in doing, is going to all the worst emitters, going to every company in the public markets and saying, we need you to abide by a certain set of standards so that we can see. Right? Now, that doesn't necessarily restore trust, because that also works in a zero trust environment of saying, I'm going to be able to hold you accountable even if I don't believe what you're saying, because I've got, ideally, at some point, the SEC and the regulators, checking over your shoulder to make sure that what you're saying is real. Ultimately, to restore trust, you need people in positions of power, CEOs, investors, making hard sacrifices, right? Making short-term investments that hurt short-term earnings, that might even hurt short-term stock prices, but that show that they're serious and show that they're actually committed to the long term. In COVID, this is the example of companies that didn't lay off their workers, right? Taking that real short-term expense, but ultimately that's where they say, all right, when times were tough, we stood by you. And I think that's the sort of thing that we need to be doing across the corporate world, across the investing world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's fantastic. I mean, I guess we're coming close to the end of the time, so I guess I want to talk about what's next for Engine Number One, but also, we've had a question saying what's next in next year's AGM season. What are we looking towards? Clearly, you had a huge impact on the last AGM season. What impact are you hoping to have this time around, and what's next for you guys?
Yeah, well, let me say a word just on voting, because that is the ticker of the index fund that I described at the top of the call was the ticker is vote, right? So I think voting is one of our kind of core theories of change, because ultimately it's our most fundamental right as investors. I think probably everyone on this call, but most people in the general public don't necessarily understand that our public companies are run like little democratic republics where shareholders elect boards appoint CEOs execute strategy. And so we ultimately have the power, the accountability that goes with that to guide the direction of our public companies. And this year was in many ways a banner year for shareholder voting. We had a record number of proposals, environmental and social proposals from shareholders go forward, a record number that settled before going to meetings, a record number that passed, a record number of support. We had just this year, we had something like 11 climate-related proposals in the US, 11 climate-related proposals pass. Doesn't sound like a lot in a public market that has 3,000, 4,000 public companies, but that's 11 compared to 3 last year and 0 the year before that, right? Amazing to think that in 2019, shareholders couldn't pass a single proposal of companies related to climate change. And that same trend is true across the board. The support for diversity, equity, and inclusion proposals doubled year over year, 24% in 2020, 47% this year. Even just the number of proposals grew by 27% to 408 going forward this year. So I think what we're seeing now finally is investors a little bit waking up to the idea that they've got this power that they can exercise at annual meetings. And I suspect that's going to continue into next year. Given the success this year, I think you'll see more bold proposals go forward from investors. Given the success of our activist campaign, I wouldn't be surprised if you see more campaigns that are built on social and environmental issues. And from our own perspective, a continued focus on climate, of course. I think in many ways, ESG investing for a lot of folks is becoming climate investing because of the sheer scale of that problem, but also a growing focus on workforce issues and on DEI. I think we're finally getting to see the momentum behind that. We had first-time proposals this year on racial equity at financial institutions that gained a huge amount of support for first-time proposals. So I'm excited for seeing this kind of growing focus on the power of shareholders to drive change from within, and I think that'll just continue to grow over the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I'd also encourage you to think about the E of ESG being more than just climate change. I think it's very tempting to think about it just in terms of GHG emissions, but actually wider things, biodiversity, deforestation, water pollution, those sort of things. And I guess you've talked a lot about kind of the role of public markets and other things, but what about alternative investments, private equity, hedge funds? What are you doing to bring them with you on this party, and what can they be doing more effectively?
Yeah, ultimately, I think one thing that we tried to do with Engine No.1 is take some of, I think what's really good about private markets impact investing, this focus on measurement, this focus on additionality, this focus on trying to show your impact in a way that I think we were unsatisfied with in a lot of public markets ESG investing. It was not always clear what impact switching your money from a traditional S&P 500 index fund, for instance, to the ESG version of that, especially those shares being voted the same way and the asset managers engaging the same way. And so we tried to, for any asset class, and this is what I tell for all investors they should do, for any asset class, really examine what is the theory of change. Is it, I think a lot of impact investing is still relying on this this notion like Grameen Bank and micro-lending that money is flowing to places where it's never flowed before, and that's the impact. I think for a lot of climate investing, for a lot of impact investing, that's no longer true. Oftentimes it's 12 VCs trying to elbow out each other for 8 slots in a deal or 3 slots in a deal. That is not a capital-starved company where your impact comes from providing capital where it can't be provided otherwise. And so I would say for every asset class, and there's a lot of innovation that's still to be had in debt and real estate and government bonds and otherwise, for every asset class, really examining what is the theory of change, how are they claiming they'll be able to deliver impact, and then assessing at the end of the year, did they actually accomplish that?
Fantastic. And I think just in the final couple of minutes that we've got, what is your message to the people listening, to our audience, on what they can and should be doing? I think we talked quite broadly about everybody's got a role to play and use every hat that they have, but very much this audience is very much financial services audience in the UK. What should we be doing to drive as much change as we can?
Yeah, we especially with climate, there's I think a rightful focus on innovation. How are we going to get green concrete, green steel, green jet fuel? I think all the innovations happening around carbon capture, around electric vehicles. So a huge and rightful focus on innovation. I think we need to remember that we need just as much innovation in the financial markets as we need in companies themselves. And that's innovation in fund strategy, in fund structure, in terms of deals of how do you align the long-term interests of the end investor, the pensioner, the person who's saving for their retirement, who truly thinks on a decades-long horizon, diversified across the entire planet. How do we align the interests of companies and then every intermediary between the company and the end investor to be focused on that sort of long-term, diversified, universal creation of value? I think it's going to require a lot of innovation. And so that means that we need end investors to be holding up a high bar and constantly on the guard for, I think, we are on the guard for greenwashing from companies, and same thing, the people we're raising capital from have to be on the guard for greenwashing from investment firms. I think only if we do that will we actually be able to make something of this movement and be able to show the impact in the real markets, in the real world, on the atmosphere that we're hoping to accomplish.
Michael, fantastic. Thank you so much. I particularly enjoyed the soundtrack of New York City in the background. And thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Your passion and energy, I think, really shines through. So keep up the exciting work. And we really look forward to seeing what you guys get up to at the next AGM season and beyond. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to our first episode of 2022 over here on the UK SIF Leadership Podcast. A reminder that our members can watch or indeed rewatch all of the sessions from our autumn conference on the Knowledge Hub on our website, uksif.org. Remember to like, subscribe and tune in for more exciting episodes coming soon. And until then, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.